Okay, we're on the last slide. Those were great talks. Thank you very much for having me, and I was very privileged to have seen those talks. I was also very happy to know this was actually going to be about outer space. I told someone I was talking about food in outer space, and they said, "Oh, I think your panel's about just like space, like architecture," and I really panicked. So it was nice to be reassured that this is about outer space. So these are all brand new ideas. They're totally untested. In fact, I'm showing 2 projects that we've started as a studio in the last 2 weeks. So I'm looking forward to seeing if there's things that be contested or debated after the talk. But my name is Zack Denfeld. I'm an American artist living in Dublin, Ireland, a part-time researcher at the Science Gallery, Dublin. But recently, most of my inspiration for my work comes from the 3 years I spent teaching and working in Bangalore, India, at the Srishti School of Art and Design. So this is an image of me and some of my students in the food market there in Bengaluru. And in 2010, I met another artist and started collaborating named Cathrine Kramer. Here you can see her final thesis research project called the Cloud Project. This project was an attempt to make it snow strawberry ice cream. As a provocation, this was at the time of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, and there was a lot of discussion about cloud seeding, and she wanted to bring that conversation to a wider audience, to also talk about geoengineering, whether or not we should try to control some of the planet's flows at that scale. And so this traveled around England and then to China, and people visited, got free ice cream, and saw these rockets that tried to make it snow, to sort of have this debate. So as you can imagine, when I met her, I had a very big crush on her, food and emerging technology. So actually, we dated first, and then we started collaborating. So we started a group called the Center for Genomic Gastronomy. We describe it as an artist-led think tank that examines the biotechnology and biodiversity of human food systems. So increasingly, I'm starting to think that it's somewhere between architecture and pop music. And in the last 6 years, we've collaborated with scientists, chefs, farmers, and hackers, and shown our work in North America, Europe, and Asia. So we disseminate our work in the form of lectures, exhibitions, meals, labs, workshops, and publications. Other things we'd love to do is like a cooking show, more restaurants, things like that. But we've primarily conducted research about eating here on planet Earth. But in the last year, we've gotten more and more interested in all of the wonderful research that's happening about food in outer space. And so we've started attending some workshops with ESA, the European Space Agency, because one of the ways they're trying to reach out to citizen scientists or tinkerers or hackers or makers is bringing this concept of especially food in outer space. Having people play with that down here with aeroponic systems or doing urban farming, and also imagining how that research might apply in space and how that might reflect back down on the planet Earth, and look at some of our own challenges of carbon emissions and food wastage. So we've been going to these workshops. They've been really interesting. But before we rocket off into space, which will be most of the talk, it will be helpful to define a few terms, because each of the words in the title of our studio have been quite specifically chosen. And I apologize that there's a couple of technical terms. So there'll be 3 slides of that, and then there'll be mostly, I think, good, interesting pictures. So we chose genomics because it enables scientists to study genetic variability and interactions between all of an organism's genes and the environments. So, I mean, we chose this as opposed to, let's say, the word genetics, because we were quite interested in the multiple scales that could be sort of implied: environment, population, organism, and gene. And it was much more systems-based, holistic, and non-reductive than the way, let's say, genetics was being used in 2010. And gastronomy is the art of eating food. We are artists, after all. So genomic gastronomy is the study of organisms and environments that are manipulated by human food cultures. So we do have a mission statement, which is to map food controversies, prototype alternative culinary futures, and imagine a more just, biodiverse, and beautiful food system. And I think beautiful is the key word there because it's a word that you're not supposed to use in contemporary art so much or really in science. And it throws most people off when we start to talk to them, which is great. But it forces us to actually consider what would a beautiful food system look like? What does beautiful AI look like? What do we mean by these more subjective desires? So behind us in this image, you can see a poster that says, "We have always been biohackers." This is one of the first projects that we completed. And we collected a bunch of fruits and vegetables from the markets where we were living at that time in Amsterdam to kind of show the range of colors, textures, and shapes that had been bred into these organisms as we've been manipulating the heck out of their genomes for 10,000 years. So by always in the poster, I guess we mean about 10,000 years. It's just a long time for us as humans. Okay, so Genomic Gastronomy has a few origin stories, but here is one. We started out as a satirical counter-movement to molecular gastronomy. As artists interested in the language and strange subculture of haute cuisine, or expensive restaurants, I guess you could say, but not ever having actually eaten at any extremely fancy restaurants, we proposed a counterfactual cuisine and called it Genomic Gastronomy, a sort of shadow movement to molecular gastronomy's reign. So for the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to walk you through these three, I think maybe, genres of cooking in haute cuisine. So we understand molecular gastronomy as being primarily about control and kitchen chemistry. Basically, it's about high modernism, abstraction, breaking things down and isolating them in order to study them and build them back up. So manipulating chemical properties of food for the purpose of creating enticing flavors, textures, and sometimes cultural narratives. So there's a really rich conversation in this particular ecosystem between the chef in the kitchen and the processors and technologists who support the kind of experimentation and novelty they're looking for. But in molecular gastronomy, foods are rarely figurative or contextualized. They become ingredients for abstraction. So in the research television program, Heston's Dinner in Space, the celebrity chef Heston Blumenthal designed special dishes for the British astronaut Tim Peake to be sent up to him and eaten on the International Space Station. If you haven't seen the show, I actually highly recommend it. I quite enjoyed it. And the show takes full advantage of Heston's knowledge of chemistry, interest in experimentation, and also his commitment to use food as a means to tell stories and make emotional connections. Now, Heston Blumenthal might reject the title of molecular gastronomy, but the first 2 episodes of the show primarily take place in labs of various sorts, and even the Fat Duck Kitchen, so the restaurant he has, is shown as a sterile, modernist lab, neutral, bright, and clinical. Food is stored in tubs, and lab-like equipment is in the kitchen. We almost never see the food being planted, grown, raised, or harvested. The ingredients appear out of thin air into the kitchen and are transformed spectacularly. But in 2010, something interesting happened in the world of high food. The torch of the best restaurant in the world moved from the molecular gastronomy-type restaurants like Fat Duck and El Bulli to restaurants like Noma in Copenhagen and DOM in Sao Paulo that could be described more as a farm-to-plate genre. The star chef and their powers in the kitchen were still present, but now there was a supporting cast of food producers and farmers that were featured to make us feel less alienated from our food and reconnect us to the landscape where the food was produced. So in contrast to Heston Blumenthal or Fran Adria, take a look at the Noma cookbook, Time and Place in Nordic Cuisine. It's really heavy. I didn't fly over with a copy, but helpfully, it was proudly displayed on the kitchen upstairs in the hotel where I'm staying here in Tokyo, in case you doubted the global influence of this work. So I photographed it. And these pages contain meticulous platings, photograph of food installations in the modernist tradition, but they also start to add back in some dirt, some non-glossy matte finishes, materiality, cracked pottery. The pages fetishize landscape and food producers, and the farmer, like the celebrity chef, becomes a character in the theater of haute cuisine. So farm to plate displaces some of the hero worship from the genius chef to the landscape and the farmers. So it's easy to imagine molecular gastronomy or modernist cuisine in space. In fact, Heston does a great job of this in his show. But can we imagine a farm to plate in space? So you may know this vision, these artist renderings of O'Neill cylinders from the 1970s. They're problematic for a number of reasons, which I can't go into, but this could be one vision of farm to plate in space. So that's farm to plate in space. How about genomic gastronomy, which takes us back one step further and increases the supporting cast. Now the characters include those who decide what is grown and cultivated. So the rebel seed savers, the biotech companies, the community plant breeders, they all get put on stage. We think that this is already an example of genomic gastronomy in space, which I'll show you right now, a short video.
Astronauts needed fresh food, where they thought it would be good for them, good for morale, probably good for nutrition too, but just to have something fresh to eat, they thought was a worthwhile experiment. But they had to be very careful because they had never grown anything to eat in space before, and they don't know what the hazards are. So they were looking specifically for plants that had the lowest levels of microbial growth on the leaf. In the 1990s, I made this cross between a couple of old lettuces, and it created this lettuce that was particularly dark red. I began to call it outrageous. Just a couple years ago, Lane and I were sitting in New York State, and Lane's reading her cell phone, and she says, "Oh, look at that, the first lettuce grown in space. It's going to be a red lettuce." NASA, apparently, I didn't know this, nobody from Johnny's told me, NASA screened a bunch of lettuce that they had purchased from Johnny's, and they chose outrageous lettuce to be the first lettuce grown on the International Space Station.
We select.
So that's Frank Morton, who's a plant breeder at Wild Garden Seeds, and we came to learn about his work from the Culinary Breeding Network and Lane Selman over there. Through the Culinary Breeding Network, Frank receives chef and consumer input that he incorporates into his breeding process. So that, to me, is applied genomic gastronomy. And so we can add Lane Selman and Frank Morton to the stage of high cuisine. We'd love to make some food for ourselves in outer space, but we'd probably want to intervene after things arrive, maybe breed a new cultivar for space or inoculate some plants with some microorganisms. An early hero of ours is Don Petit, an astronaut that smuggled up some sunflower and zucchini seeds, not to grow as a scientific experiment, but for pleasure, to care for, and to share the space with. So this is some of his DIY aquaponic systems, DIY aeroponic systems for zucchini. So one place we're currently hoping to contribute to this conversation is through our own research into endophytes. We have a project we just started with a botany department called Rare Endophyte Collector Club. And endophytes are the microorganisms that live inside of plants. It's not well understood what the relationships are, but researchers are trying to develop maybe biopesticides or biofertilizers as an alternative to our chemical agriculture we use. And we'll be looking into the culinary application as well. So in the future, you might add your spice and seasoning before the plant even fully grows. Here are some examples of endophytes we've started to isolate. So this is a project that's ongoing, and microorganisms have such a presence in space and in food, and we think there's maybe a nice collaboration to be had there. And it's important to think about taste. We think taste matters, and I'll just have two quick questions that we ask ourselves before I leave you. And taste matters because we make lots of choices based on aesthetics, beauty, disgust, and flavor, and it would be silly not to take these into account. That's what I kept thinking about during the AI conversation this morning. So how does our environment taste, and what do we taste like? Are questions we've asked in the past. 2012, we started smog tasting, which uses egg foams to harvest air pollution so that smog from different locations can be tasted and compared. We were seeing lots of data about smog, but it wasn't really sinking in. And when we fed people smog, they kind of got the message in an interesting way. So when you whip egg whites, they become 90% air. So working with students in Bangalore, India, we collected Bangalore smog, fed it to folks. We collected it from different parts of the city, and it turns out that when you show people on a map where the different meringues come from, you get a pretty good idea about what they think about that place. Some people eat these, some people don't. Other sort of researchers have taken this kind of work forward, which is always exciting to us. But we wanted to be able to synthesize smog, so this is actually a smog synthesizer in California. We built our own, and so we started whipping up our own smogs in situ. This was a London Pea Super style smog that we could serve to people, and in this case, we served it to all the health ministers of the world at the World Health Organization, which is a pretty amazing palette to try to serve. And we've also served people in New York City, and all of their response are like, "Oh my God, am I going to be sick?" It's like, "What do you think you're breathing right now?" And so you can see that it kind of hits home for them. And finally, what do we taste like? I think as we look back at the Earth and start to understand our place in the universe more and more over the last century, with that new image of the Earth from outer space, we think about our smallness. How do we taste to the small organisms that consume part of us every day and every last bit of us when we die? How can humans manipulate our bodies, diet, and emotions to change our own flavor? So closed-loop systems force us to contend with all the stuff that comes off of our bodies, and something has to consume it. And we're particularly inspired by these moths in Thailand that land on mammals' eyes and drink their tears or sweat, and they seem to particularly like humans. So to flavor our tears is a new concept restaurant we're developing. It's been a bit of a crap year for the planet and for the US, where I'm from, and so the idea is you'd come in here and have a good cry in the booth, give yourself that freedom to deal with those emotions, and you would feed the moths. They would come and drink your tears. So we already spend a lot of time making our food flavorful and making ourselves beautiful. Why wouldn't we want to flavor ourselves well for the organisms that consume us? Will the chefs of the future help us taste good to the non-humans that eat us? So we looked at these three genres of cooking, and I just want to introduce two new terms that I hope you take away with you. As we move to a place where we're looking at the whole planet and the flows of the planet, where we treat human civilization as part of those flows and not separate, and actually move beyond genomic gastronomy to a Gaian gastronomy that considers the whole planet and our place on it in an integrated way. And as we move to the fringes of the planet and off it, where we develop a permaculture in outer space, a permanent agriculture implying a permanent human culture. I haven't gotten any space scientists or permaculture enthusiasts in the room to hash it out, but I would love to do that, maybe with your help. So with that, thank you very much.